I'd like to invite Mr. Bill Gerling from Senior Analyst, International Hydropower Association. Yeah, so it is building on the previous presentation. It'll be very interesting.
Thanks very much. I'm very pleased that I've had the crowd seated with some hydropower knowledge now, and it's not as difficult for me to move into a discussion around hydropower. Mine is a presentation that is actually going to be kind of part one of a presentation I will be continuing on in the next session. But this is going to be largely about the assessment of climate resilient hydropower projects and the methodologies that IHA are involved with. So I can ask maybe to change the slide, please. So first I'll start off with a brief introduction of who we are and how we work with organizations like yourselves and with organizations like BRD, and tell you a little bit about the work we're doing on developing climate resilience criteria with the World Bank and other lending organizations, and then move on to a few of the next steps that we're proceeding on, and that will kind of seed this discussion I'll have this afternoon, or sorry, in the next session, I suppose. Next slide, please. So this is just really something a lot of you may have seen already. This just puts hydropower in perspective with all other energy sources. The REN 21 Global Status Report illustrates that of all energy sources, renewable energy is now making up about 25%. This is a slightly outdated chart. It's really now closer to 25% of the total. And of that, hydropower makes up about 75 or 80% of that renewable energy at 16.6%. Have I got control now? Okay, I'm seeing it. There we go. So IHA, International Hydropower Association, is a non-for-profit. We work based out of London. We're a member-based company, and our goal is to implement strategies and knowledge building to promote the sustainable development of hydropower projects around the world. These are our four main guiding targets that we follow within the organization. We know that there's a large range of low carbon capacity available in hydropower, but hydropower offers, as we've talked about several times in the last day or so, operating flexibility and efficiency. It plays in a very important role in grid stability for fast startup and shutdown. It's highly efficient and has adjustable output. It also provides energy storage and backup for variable renewables such as wind and solar power. Particularly pumped storage is very good at that. And more germane to the discussion that we're having here today, it provides multiple freshwater services. And you'll hear us talk about adaptation services that hydropower provides. Really, that's where we see hydropower fitting into the climate change picture through the adaptation services it can provide with flood and drought mitigation, as well as the other services that larger storage projects can provide with water supply, irrigation, navigation, tourism, and the like. Our work is in climate change is really in three different areas. We categorize them as climate change mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. We like to separate those into distinct silos. The work we're doing on emissions is largely to do with the measurement of greenhouse gas emissions from reservoirs, all reservoirs, but in the development of the work that we've been doing, we've been able to develop a tool called the GRES tool, which is developed under a joint initiative with UNESCO and with support from the World Bank. And that is a tool that will provide a more accurate and representation of the emissions that come from hydropower reservoirs, which are only a portion of all reservoirs. It's a very important part of our work, and we've made significant advances in that area. We also think of mitigation as the role that hydropower plays as a renewable in its own right, offering clean energy to the energy mix, but also in terms of the, as I mentioned earlier, the value that storage can bring through balancing services and its ability to enable even higher penetrations of wind and solar. Resilience, which is what we're talking about today, is really about the identification of the risk and the measures that can be taken to make hydropower projects more climate-proof, climate-resilient. I'll be talking more about the guidelines in the session following, but I'll mention a little bit more about that just in a few minutes. And then adaptation, as I mentioned, is what we see as the ability to store and regulate water flow to provide services to protect against increased flood, drought, frequency, intensity, and so on. So those are the areas that IHA work in. I'm going to be talking to you specifically now about the, change the slide, the resilience guidelines. So as I mentioned, we're working closely together with World Bank and EBRD. Craig is also involved in this, to develop hydropower-specific guidelines for climate resilience. I'm going to ask you to leave your questions specifically on the guidelines till the next session, because that's what I'll be talking to you about in the next session, more on the actual guidelines. Next slide, please. And what we are basing the guidelines on is essentially 4 criteria. And these are actually very basic, well understood principles of engineering. There's really nothing earth-shattering or alarming about how this process came to be. It really comes out of the standard engineering pre-feasibility, feasibility, and design processes of engineering. But it's being put in a much more simple to understand framework, we hope, that practitioners, financiers will be able to get a hold of and basically walk through a checklist. It'll be set up in a form that is almost like a checklist, where you ask yourself a number of different questions, the ones that you're seeing on the screen here, and you follow through this process, and it's like a due diligence check. Have I done this at this phase? Have I considered this? And as you go through this set of guidelines and criteria, you will be able to actually determine how well you've done at each stage and what work will have to be done. So it begins with analysis. It's a simple question: what is the potential impact of climate change at the site identified through reasonable modeling? So this can be quite a range of possible types of analyses, ranging from the kinds of things that Craig described, fairly straightforward. I won't call them back of the envelope, because that's not giving due consideration to the work that was done in that particular exercise, but taking advantage of available models, available knowledge in the area, and putting together a fairly simple to use scenario analysis that you can then base your own decisions on, and may not have to involve a huge amount of detailed analysis. From that type of analysis, then there's a decision has to be made in terms of what kind of scenarios have I got the capacity to and the knowledge to undertake. In almost every case, there will have to be some sort of a scenario analysis set up. And the question that is asked: has a reasonable set of climate scenarios been developed and applied to project design? It can be also applied to existing projects. But this type of scenario analysis is not unlike what Craig just described. It can be a selection of models. It can be an ensemble of models that are available in that country. Like, for instance, in Canada, we've had the luxury of having an organization in Quebec who do this. They create ensembles of models. We have access to them, and we can then run those models against our own hydrologic models. Following that comes the most important step, the risk assessment. So have the scenarios been used to stress test the project to identify vulnerabilities, particularly those that are associated with safety, the structural and societal, and even the business model, the economic. What we're promoting in this step is to develop a risk assessment matrix, something that illustrates over a range of scenarios and a range of perhaps project sizes or project types what the elements of risk are, what elements of the hydropower project are at risk. And then, of course, what follows is a definition of the adaptation strategies as a solution. What structural and functional measures are in place or can be put in place to avoid or reduce the identified risk. And in some cases, this can be no-regret solutions, such as simply move a structure to a higher location, or modify the operating strategies to allow for more adaptive types of operations at that site. Or it may be something that is longer term that requires perhaps rebuilding a spillway, something of that nature. And I'll conclude with some work that we're doing with the Climate Bonds Initiative, and I can talk to you a little bit more about that in the next session because I have a little more time. But these criteria that I've just mentioned are actually going to be applied against the Climate Bonds Initiative. Some of you in the room may be familiar with that. It's unfortunate that Anna Creed, who was invited to this event, could not make it, but she would have told you all about it. But these criteria are to be actually available to the Climate Bonds Initiative by the end of this year. Our CEO, Richard Taylor, sits on a technical working group, and they will be looking for us to provide guidance on this in the very near future. So that is all I'm going to say for now. I'll certainly answer some questions at the end of this session, and then I will be available again in the next session. So thank you very much.